For years, the world waited. Headlines teased revelations, lawyers promised disclosures, courts hinted at transparency. Yet again and again, the powerful slipped into the shadows, their secrets locked away. But tonight, the survivors are done. Waiting. The room was packed, journalists shoulder to shoulder. Microphones stacked like weapons of truth, cameras blinking with restless anticipation. A hush swept across the press hall, the kind of silence that only comes before something seismic. And then, with a steady voice carrying both tremor and steel, a survivor stepped forward. We've heard the excuses. We've seen the cover-ups. We've felt the silence. That ends today. We are making our own list, and we will release it. The words landed like thunder. Gasps rippled through the crowd, pens froze mid-scratch, and camera flashes erupted like lightning against storm clouds. For a moment, even the air seemed to tighten, as if history itself had leaned in to listen. These were not politicians seeking power. These were not celebrities hungry for attention. These were women who had been ignored, dismissed, told their voices didn't matter. And now, they were rewriting the narrative. They were seizing the authority that courts and billionaires had tried to deny them. It wasn't just a press statement. It was defiance. It was a declaration of war against silence. The survivors knew what they risked: ridicule, retaliation, the relentless weight of institutions designed to protect the powerful. Yet here they stood, refusing to cower, their courage illuminating a darkness that billionaires, princes, and moguls thought would never be pierced. And as the echoes of their vow reverberated beyond the Rumantos social media feeds into whispered conversations across dinner tables in small towns and sprawling cities, the world felt the tremor. If the system would not give the truth, the survivors would. But with that single, electrifying promise came the question that hung like a storm cloud over the nation. Who will be on that list? And how many pillars of power are about to crumble? When it finally sees the light, because this wasn't just a press conference, it was the opening shot of a reckoning. And what happens next could leave the entire country in disbelief. The Epstein saga has always been more than one man's crimes. It is a mirror held up to power, a story of how wealth and connections can bend justice until it snaps. For years, the case has been defined by frustration, sealed court documents, redacted pages, names whispered but never spoken aloud. Judges cited privacy, lawyers spoke of due process, and the public was told time and time again that the truth was too sensitive to release. Each deferral felt less like justice and more like collusion. The survivors lived those delays as wounds reopened. Every headline promising answers that never came was a reminder of how deeply the system had failed them. They watched billionaires retreat to private islands, politicians brush off questions, and powerful institutions calculate that silence was safer than exposure. The public, too, grew restless. Social media feeds flooded with demands for transparency. Hashtags surged. Hashtag unseal the names. Hashtag who knew what. But no matter the outcry, the files remained locked away. And that is why this moment, this announcement's so explosive. The survivors are not waiting for courts to rule, for prosecutors to tiptoe through technicalities, or for politicians to decide whether accountability is convenient. They are bypassing the gatekeepers altogether. By creating their own list, they are reclaiming the very weapon that has been wielded against them. Information, it is groundbreaking because it shifts the balance of power. Until now, the story has been told from the top down, controlled by elites, who filter what the public can know. This list represents a bottom-up revolution. It is the survivors saying, "We will not be silenced. We will not let you bury us in legal jargon or procedural delays. We hold the receipts, and the world deserves to see them. The stakes could not be higher." These names are not just footnotes in legal documents. They represent careers, dynasties, reputations built on illusion. Hollywood moguls whose faces still grace movie posters. Wall Street titans whose money funds elections. Politicians who shape laws that govern millions. If even a fraction of those names appear on the survivors list, the shockwaves will not. stop at one courthouse, they will ripple through every corridor of power. And that is precisely why the survivor's bravery resonates so deeply. This is not just about exposing Epstein's circle. It is about survival versus silence, truth versus suppression. They know the danger. They know the machinery of power will try to discredit them, intimidate them, perhaps even erase their credibility. All together, yet they are moving forward, not as individuals fractured by trauma, but as a chorus unified by justice. Because for them, silence is no longer an option. And for the rest of us, watching from the outside, the question is unavoidable. If the survivors succeed, what happens to the world we thought we knew? The answer may not simply be scandal. It may be a reckoning so profound that governments, Hollywood, and Wall Street are forced to confront the rot they have long denied. And as whispers of that possibility spread, anticipation builds. The survivors have fired the opening shot. The next move? It could shake the pillars of power themselves. But to understand why the list terrifies so many, we must revisit the dark empire it threatens to expose. To understand why this survivor-driven list carries such weight, you must confront the shadowed empire that made it necessary. Jeffrey Epstein was not merely a man. He was a network. His fortune, whose origins remain clouded in secrecy, bought him more than private jets and mansions. It bought him access. Access to Wall Street's boardrooms, to Hollywood's elite parties. 2 political fundraisers were million-dollar. Checks could open doors that laws could not. Epstein moved like smoke through the corridors of influence. He was a donor, a fixer, a friend of those who lived above accountability. He cultivated the image of the charming financier who could solve problems and make introductions. In truth, he was weaving a web. Every dinner with a senator, every photo with a prince, every deal with a hedge fund titan wasn't just social currency, it was insulation. Power protected power, and Epstein was its loyal broker. But he did not act alone. Behind him stood a gallery of enablers lawyers who twisted the legal system until it broke. Securing sweetheart deals that mocked justice, socialites who smiled for photographs, their presence lending him legitimacy while shielding him from suspicion, politicians who accepted donations, who looked the other way, who made sure the machinery of government turned a little slower whenever Epstein's name appeared. These were the villains behind the villain, each one complicit in their silence. Each one deciding that proximity to power was worth more than the innocence of children. And innocence is what was betrayed, repeatedly, systematically, callously. Young lives stolen and discarded so the wealthy could maintain their illusion of untouchable glamour. The contrast could not be starker. The gilded halls of Manhattan mansions versus the silent trauma carried by those who entered them and never emerged the same. And still, the names remain hidden. Why? Because exposure does not just threaten reputations, it threatens empires. To reveal them is to expose how deeply corruption is woven into the fabric of privilege. It is to admit that the same names etched onto buildings, credited in movies, elected to office, may also be etched into sealed court files that judges refuse to unseal. It is to collapse the myth that the system protects the vulnerable when, in fact, it too often shields the powerful. That is why secrecy persists. That is why documents remain locked away. Because if the truth comes out, it will not be a scandal confined to one man. It will be a revelation of how many hands built his fortress, how many voices stayed silent, how many guardians of justice looked the other way. But while the powerful hid in shadows, the survivors built something else entirely: courage. Behind every headline, beyond every courtroom battle, there are human lives. The survivors of Jeffrey Epstein's world are not abstractions. They are people whose childhoods were stolen, whose innocence was traded like currency, whose pain was silenced by money and influence. Yet when you look closely, you do not see only brokenness. You see resilience, and you see fire. Some were teenagers, lured with promises of opportunity, modeling contracts, scholarships, introductions to people who could change their lives. Instead, their lives were changed in the most brutal way imaginable. One recalls being just 16, stepping nervously into a mansion where she was told her dreams would begin. only to have them end that same night. Another describes boarding a private plane, thinking it was the beginning of adventure, only to discover it was a gilded prison. For years, many lived in silence. They carried their trauma quietly, working jobs, raising families, struggling to make sense of a world that rewarded their abuser while burying their truth. Nightmares followed them. Depression haunted them. The smallest triggers of cologne, a photograph in a magazine, could drag them back into memories they desperately tried to escape. Yet even as the trauma stalked them, there was something else, taking root inside them, the will to fight. One survivor turned her pain into advocacy, volunteering at shelters for young girls to ensure others would not face what she had endured. Another pursued education, becoming a lawyer, determined to master the very system that once ignored her. And still another, after years of silence, decided to speak publicly. Her trembling voice broadcast on national television, shaking the illusion that Epstein was untouchable. These are not victims, they are fighters. Fighters who discovered that the very act of speaking was itself a form of defiance. Each story, each testimony, was a strike against the wall of silence that Epstein and his enablers built. Each time they stood before cameras, knowing they would be scrutinized, doubted, even ridiculed, they chose courage over fear. What binds them together is not only what was taken from them, but what they chose to reclaim: dignity, agency, truth. By stepping into the light, they stripped away the carefully manufactured aura of power surrounding Epstein's circle. They reminded the world that beneath the money, the mansions, the political connections, there were human beings whose lives had been shattered. And unlike those who covered for Epstein, the survivors have no hidden agenda. Their authority is not bought with checks or secured by status. It is earned through pain endured and truth told. That moral authority makes their vow to release names more powerful than any court ruling. When they speak, the world leans in, not because of wealth or influence, but because they have survived the worst and still stand. And yet, their journeys took on a new dimension when they found each other. Alone, each one carried fragments of a story. Together, they carried a movement. They shared experiences, recognized the patterns, and realized that their pain was not isolated, it was systemic. That realization transformed them from isolated voices into a chorus too loud to ignore. They found strength in numbers, in community, in knowing that when one faltered, another would hold her up. When the survivors found each other, what they decided to do left the world in disbelief. The survivors' courage did not unfold in a vacuum. For every voice that broke the silence, there was a counterforce trying to shove it back into the shadows. The institutions that should have protected them, the courts, the press, the guardians of justice, too often became obstacles. Billionaires bankrolled lawyers whose job was not to uncover truth but to bury it. Legal gag orders silenced testimony under the guise of protecting privacy. Media outlets hesitated, fearful of lawsuits or of offending the powerful figures who signed their advertising checks. Every step forward felt like walking into headwinds engineered by wealth and influence. Survivors were told their memories were unreliable, their motives questionable. They were smeared as opportunists, mocked as liars, framed as chasing headlines rather than healing. Intimidation came in many forms: sudden legal threats in the mail, mysterious figures following them, jobs that disappeared after speaking out. The message was clear: stay quiet or pay the price. But still, the whispers grew. Somewhere, somehow, there existed a list. Names of those who had flown on Epstein's planes, attended his parties, lingered too long in his mansions. The survivors did not invent those whispers. They amplified them, and reminded the world that behind sealed documents lay truths too dangerous for the powerful to admit. Each hint, each rumor, became another crack in the facade, the pressure. Mounted with cinematic intensity. Imagine the contrast. Billionaires, once smug and untouchable, now nervously calculating what might surface. Politicians scanning old photographs, wondering which images might resurface. Lawyers scrambling to preempt stories not yet published. The panic was palpable. These were the same figures who once looked down on the survivors as disposable. Now they feared them, And what of the survivors? They stood calmer than their adversaries. Not because their trauma had vanished, but because the fear had been transformed into resolve. They had already lived through the worst. No smear campaign could compete with the memory of stolen youth. No gag order could erase the truth etched into their lives. And so they did not tremble. They waited, steady and unshakable, as the world's most powerful men and women squirmed under the weight of secrets too heavy to keep forever. The stage was set for confrontation. On one side, institutions fortified by wealth, scrambling to contain the fallout. On the other, survivors who had nothing left to lose, and therefore everything to give. The balance of power had shifted, and the old order knew it. And then came the moment everyone feared. The survivors spoke as one. It began with a simple sentence, but it landed like a detonation. In front of a wall of microphones, with cameras blinking red and the air taut with anticipation. One survivor stepped forward and declared, "If the system will not tell the truth, then we will. We are building our own list and we will release it." For a moment, the room froze. Journalists stared at one another as if checking whether they had truly heard what was just spoken. Pens hovered midair. The click of camera shutters stalled. And then, like thunder cracking after a long silence, the noise erupted. Gasps rippled through the hall. Phones lit up as reporters fired off tweets. Within seconds, the phrase "our own list" was trending. This was no idle threat. This was the survivors seizing the narrative, tearing it away from courtrooms and legal maneuvers, from billionaires' back channels and politicians' whispers. For years, the story had been defined by secrecy. But with this announcement, the survivors turned secrecy itself into a weapon against those who had hidden behind it. The suspense was electric. Who would appear on this list? Whose name had been protected by redacted documents and sealed testimonies? Whose reputation had been shielded by money, lawyers, and influence? The whispers began immediately. Commentators speculated about the powerful. Names long rumored but never confirmed. Actors who had flown on private jets. Financiers who had written generous checks. World leaders photographed at Epstein's properties. Every newsroom scrambled. Every talk show host sharpened their opening monologue. Every search bar filled with the same two words, Epstein list. And beyond the speculation lay history, the long, ugly pattern of cover-ups. Viewers remembered how institutions had bent over backward to protect predators before. They recalled the decades it took for Hollywood's open secrets to collapse. They remembered the Catholic Church scandals, the corporate hush money cases, the countless moments when power was preserved at the expense of innocence. Against that backdrop, the survivors' promise resonated as both a threat and a beacon.
Ow.
This was not just about Epstein. It was about ending the cycle of cover-ups once and for all. Online, the reaction bordered on frenzy. Hashtags like #TheList, #TruthWillOut, and #names now surged to the top of global trends. Memes spread at lightning speed, courtroom sketches, edited with question marks, flight logs repurposed as digital wanted posters, side-by-side images of politicians smiling with Epstein juxtaposed with the caption "Soon." News networks broke into programming with urgent banners. Survivors announced plan to release Epstein list. Cable chirons flashed words like bombshell, earthquake, reckoning. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, the villains of this story began to crack. The same figures who had once laughed off questions or brushed aside rumors now found themselves pacing in panic. Lawyers' phones buzzed non-stop as clients demanded assurances. Publicists drafted statements, some preemptively denying any connection, others pleading for respect of privacy. Hedge fund managers barked at assistants to scrub old photographs from the internet. Politicians held whispered meetings wondering which of their colleagues might be dragged into the light. Arrogance. Once their armor had shattered, in its place was naked fear. For the first time, the balance of terror had shifted from the survivors to the powerful, and through it all, the survivors remained steady. Their voices cut through the fog of speculation like steel. They were not gloating, not sensationalizing. They were resolute. "This is not about revenge," one survivor explained. her voice calm but unyielding. "It's about truth. It's about making sure no one can hide behind money and lawyers ever again." Another added, "We know what it means to speak out. We know the risks, but we also know what silence costs. We're done paying that price." Their words struck harder than any headline. Because unlike the institutions that had failed them, they spoke without calculation, without agenda beyond truth. Their credibility did not come from power. It came from pain endured and survival achieved. That authenticity pierced the shield of corruption more effectively than any subpoena could. For the public watching at home, the spectacle was unforgettable. It was the mic drop moment of a generation, a reversal of the narrative in which the most marginalized voices, long dismissed, now dictated the terms, and for the powerful, it was a nightmare. Each sentence the survivors spoke was another tremor rattling foundations they thought unshakable. Each vow to publish the list was another crack in the carefully constructed walls of secrecy. The survivors had thrown down the gauntlet, and the world was watching to see who would be named, who would fall, who would scramble to deny the undeniable. The announcement was not just a promise of revelation. It was a challenge to every institution that had conspired, knowingly or unknowingly, to keep these names buried. It forced a choice: side with the survivors and demand transparency, or side with silence and watch credibility collapse. And in that moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Because this wasn't just a press conference, it was the ignition of a fuse, and no one knew how far the explosion would reach. But once the shock hit, the aftershocks traveled even faster. The announcement traveled at the speed of light. Within minutes of the survivors' vow to release their own list, Twitter now erupted into a frenzy. Hashtags like #TheList, #Epstein Files, and #Truth will outsurge to the top of the platform's global trending charts. Users speculated endlessly, piecing together old flight logs, resurfacing photographs, and dissecting archived interviews. Some posted grainy paparazzi shots with cryptic captions. "He was there. Remember this face?" Others shared videos of the press conference, looping the survivors' words until they sounded like a war cry. TikTok followed suit. Clips of the announcement spread like wildfire, intercut with dramatic music, flashing text overlays, and slow-motion edits. Teenagers who hadn't even been born when Epstein first built his empire were now weighing in, stitching videos with commentary like, "This is bigger than anything we've seen Hollywood. Politics, finance, everyone's shaking." The survivors' courage was transforming into culture, becoming not just news, but history in the making. Consumed and reshared across every feed. Late-night comedians jumped in too. One cracked, "Apparently the survivors are dropping their own list. Forget Netflix true crime, this is the real cliffhanger series." Another deadpan, "Politicians are sweating so much tonight that the White House had to call a plumber." The laughter masked the unease. Everyone knew this wasn't just another scandal, it was a reckoning. Political commentary grew sharper by the hour. Progressive leaders demanded transparency, framing the survivors' list as an indictment of a justice system that had failed them. One senator tweeted, "If survivors are doing what our institutions refuse to do, then the institutions are broken. We must act." Conservative figures, more cautious, urged restraint but couldn't hide their nervousness. Some dodged interviews, entirely leaving cable news anchors to speculate about what or who they were trying to avoid. Through it all, the emotional beat rang clear. The survivors were vindicated. For years, they had been ridiculed, ignored, even threatened. But now, millions stood with them. Tweets poured in from strangers, thanking them for their bravery. TikTok comments overflowed with words like heroes and warriors, and living. Rooms and offices across the country, people who had once dismissed their testimonies now found themselves moved, even haunted by their defiance. The ripple effect was immediate. Journalists who had quietly shelved Epstein-related files dug them back out, their editors suddenly eager for stories that had once been deemed too risky. Investigative teams began calling old sources, reopening closed leads, and filing fresh public record requests. What was once buried beneath legal threats was now seen as the biggest scoop of the decade. Politicians couldn't ignore the groundswell. Congressional staffers whispered about potential hearings. not because leaders suddenly found their moral compass, but because public outrage demanded action. To be seen as dismissive now was political suicide. A new energy pulsed through Washington, survival instinct dressed up as justice. In Hollywood, the shift was just as stark. Celebrities rushed to post carefully worded statements condemning Epstein and praising the survivors. PR firms scrambled, frantically drafting denials for clients who feared even the faintest whiff of connection. Paparazzi staked out the homes of actors and moguls long rumored to be within Epstein's orbit. Some public figures canceled appearances altogether, retreating from the spotlight until the storm passed or until they knew if their names would surface. On Wall Street, whispers spread through boardrooms. Executives who had once treated Epstein as a useful gatekeeper to wealth and influence now acted as if they had never known him. Philanthropic foundations quietly scrubbed names from donor lists, terrified that any association, no matter how tenuous, might resurface. The shift was unmistakable. The people weren't just watching anymore, they were demanding names. Ordinary citizens flooded comment sections, tagged officials in social media posts, and wrote open letters to editors. Pressure mounted on courts to unseal documents. The survivors had cracked the dam, and now the flood of public anger was unstoppable. What made this moment different from past scandals was the clarity of the moral divide. On one side were survivors who had nothing to gain but the truth. On the other were institutions with everything to lose. The public knew it, felt it, and rallied accordingly. For once, the old tricks stonewalling, smears, distractions weren't working. The survivors had shifted the center of gravity, and as hashtags surged and investigations reignited, the world waited, breathless, for the first names to fall. Because if the survivors kept their word, the list wouldn't just rattle reputations, it could rewrite history itself. In the days that followed, the speculation swirled and the demand for names reached a fever pitch. The survivors made something unmistakably clear. This was never only about a list. Yes, the names mattered. Yes, exposure was necessary. But their fight was larger, deeper, and more enduring. It was about justice. It was about prevention. It was about reclaiming the dignity stolen not only from them, but from every person who had ever been told to stay silent in the face of power. They reminded the world that a list without change is just another headline. What mattered was dismantling the system that allowed Epstein to thrive, the network of enablers, the culture of silence, the institutions that protected predators instead of the vulnerable. If all we do is shock people with names, one survivor said, then we've missed the point. We are here to make sure no one can ever build an empire of abuse again. This truth rang out louder than any courtroom ruling. Power cannot shield predators forever. For a time, it may buy silence. For a time, it may rewrite narratives. For a time, it may intimidate and manipulate. But eventually, the truth claws its way out. And when it does not whisper, it roars. The survivors' voices became that roar. In them, the world saw not weakness, but a kind of moral authority that money could not purchase and privilege could not counterfeit. Their bravery exposed a universal truth, that justice, though delayed, belongs to those who refuse to surrender it. And in claiming it, they transformed their pain into a movement. This was no longer just a battle against Epstein's ghost or his cronies hiding in the shadows. It was the birth of a moral revolution. One survivors once dismissed and doubted were now leading. They were not just speaking their truth. They were redefining what justice itself should mean in an age when corruption and secrecy run deep. Their message carried far beyond Epstein. It told every survivor of abuse, every marginalized voice, every silenced victim, you are not alone. Your truth matters, and when spoken, it can change the world. The emotional crescendo was undeniable. People saw in these survivors not victims, but visionaries, ordinary individuals who, through extraordinary resilience, had forced the world to confront its darkest corners. They showed that silence is not inevitable, that the powerful are not invincible, that even empires built on fear can crumble when confronted by the simple, unyielding demand for dignity. And as the headlines continued, As the debates raged, 1. Lesson cut through the noise like a beacon. Truth does not belong to the privileged. It does not belong to billionaires in boardrooms, politicians in backrooms, or media moguls behind cameras. Truth belongs to the people, belongs to those who lived it, survived it, and refused to let it be buried. That was the ultimate legacy of the survivors' stand. Not just the exposure of names, not just the rattling of institutions, but the reminder that the fight for justice is never truly lost as long as there are voices brave enough to rise, to speak and to lead. And in that rising, the survivors did more than tell their story. They rewrote the ending. They made their own list because silence was no longer an option. In that act of defiance, the survivors not only broke the cycle of cover-ups, they exposed the raw truth. Justice does not wait for permission. It is claimed by those willing to stand against corruption, even when the odds seem impossible. For decades, elites believed they could lock away secrets behind sealed files, that their money and influence could bury the voices of the powerless. But tonight, we know better. The survivors have proven that dignity is stronger than intimidation, that truth is louder than wealth, and that silence, when broken together, becomes a weapon more powerful than any court order. This is not the end of their story. It is the beginning of ours. Because what they've shown the world is that history isn't written by the powerful. It's written by the brave. And now, the responsibility falls on us, on you, watching right now, to make sure their courage doesn't echo into silence again. So don't just watch. Be part of this moment. Share this story. Subscribe to stay with a community that refuses to let the powerful define justice. Leave your voice in the comments, because every voice added is another reminder that survivors are not alone. The truth belongs to the people, and that we are stronger together. The survivors stood up and rewrote the script. Now it's our turn.